Elizabeth Rosenthal called it the medical industrial complex. I don't have a better, when I read that, it struck with me because I always thought of it as this kind of behemoth, like the Borg in the, it's a self-replicating thing. So in other words, every time someone has an idea, I've invented devices and patented things, and capitalism is a great thing, but if you can find ways of getting something that might be marginally useful into the system and then somehow getting it into a standard of care where someone could be punished for not using it, or then next level, the newest thing in the last 5 years is having the government mandate it and then having me get to promote it. I call it crony capitalism, where the government or a select, someone decides to promote, in social media, and having the government alter its role from George Washington days being, defense and very basic needs. We have a department for everything now, and it's generally out of our control and it doesn't really serve any individual. I try to call this whole big picture crony capitalism because it's not really. It's big people making choices that benefit them. 20 years later, they go, how were doctors giving away these meds? But the California legislature, where I did my residency, had, under the Sackler influence, either criminalized or implied criminality to not giving enough opioids. And I'm at San Francisco General Hospital, and superiors are threatening punishment if I don't give all the opioids that they demand, and then admitting it, and now you find out later, it was another industrial complex of recycling these people through the hospital.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with me Dr. Howard Stupak out of New York. And he's an ENT surgeon, which stands for extra normal transmogrification. No, it doesn't do that. I think most people know it's ear, nose, and throat, but we're going to look a little bit perhaps posterior to those organs or orifices, and talk a little bit about the conception of medicine and how we view medicine and how possibly it's been, say, distorted a little bit recently and or societally. Howard, tell us, what are your thoughts about medical practice today and how it's performed?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks for the discussion and for asking the question. And it's a good question. I'll be brief. And my view is medicine has changed over the years from kind of an attempt towards objectivity. Look, that over the history of medicine, we've been wrong about things. We've been right about, when you look really big picture, over hundreds or thousands of years. And I think in the 20th century, there was a big attempt to try to be as objective as possible, developing antimicrobials, insulin to replace it in type 1 diabetes, development of chemotherapy, using engineering to kind of fix cholera epidemics and prevent dysentery and contamination, that were, I think, huge in progress and very objective, and real people benefited. And I feel like in the last 50 years, I have a relative who's in the pharmaceutical industry who was working during that transition period, where you're finding the next aminoglycoside. And then suddenly I feel like the fruit on the tree dried up and there was no big thing to fix. Somewhere in the 90s, 2000s. And that's where I feel like we got into symptomatology focus. And then in the last 20, 30, 40 years during my career, which is, I guess I entered med school 30 years ago, it meant 35 years ago, actually. there's been an increase on focus on symptoms and then trying to go backwards and go from the symptoms to some sort of appearance of objectivity, either through surveys or finding inflammation. And I feel like we've been capitalizing on that subjectivity at the expense of trying to really understand what's going on and understanding that in some ways our society is ill. We've moved into very sedentary culture and we're treating symptoms and subjectivity and missing a lot of big picture health items by over focusing on this. And then to me, the COVID thing was kind of the culmination of all of that, where it became everything was about individual fear and trying to avoid one particle of what are I know as an ENT there's trillions of particles probably, and there's papers that show there's 500,000 particles at any 1 minute in a cubic meter of air. So suddenly we've gone just so micro thinking on an exponential level that we shut down society, actually are throwing people out of beaches, closing schools, essentially we've entered opposite world, trying to chase one symptom or one particle. And that's my view, is we lost sight of the big picture.
You make a lot of interesting points. I apologize for my analogies, but kind of it's the only brain I have. I think about firemen sometimes. In the 1990s or 80s, say, there were 10 times as many fires, kind of damaging fires in, say, we'll talk about suburbia as there are today, and grossly. So firemen have far fewer calls, even though there are more people in the country than there were then, presumably more houses. There are far few, firemen necessary calls. That's because of technology, because we have addressable alarm panels, we have smoke detectors through the house. So the big fires don't get to be big because we catch them when they're small. Just kind of bear with me for this analogy.
Yeah.
So the big diseases, as it were, the big fires, kind of were put out because we have better testing methods, and so they don't turn into big fires. They stay small fires. You can kind of, zap them with a fire extinguisher, whatnot. And so the firemen are still there. They're vestigial, and they have a union, and they're government employees, and when it's hard to get rid of, hard to fire them, and so forth. So they kind of linger on. Well, now, what do they do instead? They just kind of traipse around. They show up where EMTs are called. There's on my street, every time there's a apoplexy, heart attack, whatever, God forbid, it happens, and the firemen are there, and the ambulance is there first, and they're there hanging around. They don't. Anyway, it's kind of like a lot of policemen are just kind of hanging around, detail sites with construction workers and whatnot. I don't know about where you are in Massachusetts. They're mandated to get triple pay while they just kind of hang around. And it's because there's not that much crime here. So we need the policemen. We kind of have them doing stuff, but it's ancillary to their actual main historic function of protection or firemen and so forth. So, I think maybe what you're saying is partly kind of got rid of the big players. We knocked down most of the bowling pins, and now we split down there. We're kind of like aiming and crafting to get the rest of the thing. But we've really, we should kind of be satisfied with our 8 score and move on to the next frame and or next thing. Does any of that kind of ring true for you?
100%. That's in a lot of ways the industry, and the same way you spoke about the firemen's unions or the police unions. I mean, I have a cynical view that like some of our academies are a form of guild or union in itself, and the medical industrial complex. I don't know if have you heard this term?
The military. I actually fought against the methadone industrial complex, which is my term. But yes, I get it. That was Eisenhower's term. You actually have Eisenhower as the preface for your book. Yeah.
And I mean, and someone else, Elizabeth Rosenthal, called it the medical industrial complex. I don't have a better, when I read that, it struck with me because I always thought of it as this kind of behemoth, like the Borg in the, it's a self-replicating thing. So in other words, every time someone has an idea, I've invented devices and patented things, and capitalism is a great thing, but if you can find ways of getting something that might be marginally useful into the system, and then somehow getting it into a standard of care where someone could be punished for not using it, or
Right.
then next level, the newest thing in the last 5 years is having the government mandate it, and then having me get to promote it. I know I keep going down the same path, but what I'm saying is your analogy is great. Imagine you can the firemen. I mean, Fahrenheit 451 was essentially where they created a new role for themselves. You know, the Ray Bradbury book. I'm sure you've
Mhm.
read it.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think it's surprising that he chose that, and I think a lot of sci-fi. I sound like a dork. I've already had two sci-fi mentions in like two
It's fine.
minutes.
It's fine. I've done
Um,
firemen. I don't know.
I think it's a way of commenting on society without actually having to pick on people. Um, that they went on to burn books in that book, but you know, you create roles for yourself to create meaning, and well, our society wants stuff more than we want truth in a
Right.
way. So if I went around on my town, an upper middle class affluent town, and was like,
Mhm.
guys, I found truth, you know, they'd look at me like I was an idiot. If I went and said, I just sold a company for $2 billion, no one even asks, is it really help society? Is it a real truth? Is That's the goal. And when you have entities from insurance companies to doctors to hospitals to pharmaceuticals to device manufacturers, and I'm not picking on anyone, it's the incentive system is towards growth, and growth is not necessarily health.
Right. Well, it's tricky because I'm a free market guy. Capitalism was Karl Marx's pejorative term for the free market, because he wrote Das Kapital and so forth. So
Mhm.
but it stuck around, kind of like the Ivy League was an insult to begin with, but they wound up kind of absorbing and mutating, or not mutating, but kind of growing into the term and made it a
Mhm.
positive. So fine, capitalism. I'm okay with that because if you genuinely have a free market, these ideas will bubble up. Even if you sell your 2 billion idea and you happen to be, Elizabeth Holmes or what's the name of the new one, Javis. Um,
Mhm.
I forget. And your thing is fraudulent. The truth will out, and so it
Yeah.
doesn't get that far down the road. And the people who coughed up the $1 billion, well, bad on them, and or you get it back somehow, and so forth. Okay, fine. I think it's easier that than the second one, which basically have implicit, which is sinecure, rent seeking.
Mhm.
The fact that you get this thing up there, and then all of a sudden the government mandates it. I think a
It's
lot of what
totally
medicine has
capitalism.
become in that regard, there's been a kind of a perversion and an inversion of the medical marketplace to a certain extent. And I bring up the term grossly addiction, but you know, without making too much of a pun, there's the addictomy, the kind of the addiction part where people are, adding, say, genitals or subtracting thereof, and that has become a new medical vein, a new medical avenue for kind of long-term, change. And there's a lot of aspects throughout that reverberate through the surgical fields, and whether this becomes, I grew up in New York City, as I mentioned to you privately, and my high school was Horace Mann. Still, it's still there. It was Horace Mann School for Boys, but we graduated the first female professional tennis player, but in the 1960s, I believe. Richard Raskin became Renee Richards. So this was a thing back then. He was the William Thomas of his day, the Leah Thomas of his day, essentially. And he went from number 1,000 on the men's circuit to number 6 on the women's. Um, and so that was out there, but it wasn't necessarily as much promoted through mainstream medicine.
Mhm.
And what we're seeing now is kind of a medicalization of things that aren't really medical. They're kind of elective. So leaving the value judgment aside of whether Richard should have become Renee, whether Richard ever did become Renee, or whether that's reneged upon biologically in some form or another. It wasn't promoted here, and now we have it kind of filtering into the mainstream medicine that's generating a whole practice that we haven't even seen the full reverberations thereof over time, whether people can have secondary sexual issues and Obviously, I'm not sure that they can organize them and so forth. So there's kind of like a kind of an implicit dissatisfaction embedded in the system. We have medicalized addiction as well, narcotic addiction, so forth, by replacement therapy and whatnot. And it seems like a lot of the medical mission has become this secondary aspect to keep ourselves busy in a way, and that I'm not sure whether that's at the positive reinforcement of society and the benefit of individuals. That's not a question, but I don't know if you have any comment on any of that, or whether you want to disagree, magnify, etc.
No, I completely agree. And my comment on capitalism wasn't against capitalism, because I am pro that and individuality and developing businesses. What I completely agree with you on is about kind of a crony capital. You called it a different name. I call it crony capitalism, where the government or a select, someone decides to promote, in social media, and having the government alter its role from, a defense, from George Washington days being, defense and
Right. That's
very
mutated.
very basic needs. We have a department for everything now, and it's generally out of our control, and it doesn't really serve any individual. I try to call this whole big picture crony capitalism, because it's not really. It's big people making choices that benefit them, and it's an open market would be wonderful, and that's, I think, one of the solutions. If they were able to reboot medicine, it would be a true open market. Is this something I want?
Yeah.
The problem is, it's a big industry is corruptible, just like the military industrial complex.
Mhm.
So even in a void,
And I think that's a good analogy. I don't want to step on your feet here, but I think there's a very reasonable analogy. What we saw during COVID was kind of a military doctrinaire, without the doctor part, absorption of directive. So if you're in the military and they say march across that bridge, you don't say, oh my God, it's chilly, it's raining, can we wait like 2 hours till the sun comes out? No, you march. And in medicine, I think we saw during coronavirus episode that people weren't, taking on their individual personal bond with the patient, which is, I think, part of the Hippocratic Oath. I have to go back and look. But certainly, my essential role, I think, is to adjudicate for the patient and be the doctor, the teacher. The doctor in Greek is, orthodoxy, doctrine, and so forth, to teach the patient, and not be a tool of society. And mind you, if you're in the military, it's the opposite. It's nobody wants the individual soldier deciding what is policy at any given moment, because that's not how you run a military. You don't. The whole purpose is you have a force. And so when you have this force and it comes out through medicine, I think that's a perversion of both of those concepts in a sense.
100%. And that, I think, when medicine is at its worst, like during World War II in Europe, it was when doctors were serving a nation and following orders, essentially.
Right.
And you end up getting down the worst paths. And go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh no, I apologize. I'm stepping all over your toes here. But Andrew Klavan, I listen to. He's on the Daily Wire, and he's brilliant and hilarious. And he points out that Dr. Mengele probably, if he'd come up with, cutting off whatever, quote unquote, transing the kids, Hitler would have said, look, stick with the twins, stick with mutilating twins. That's enough. Otherwise we're kind of grossly, it's just kind of like, but here we do it. We've lost the moral high ground. I remember in the 90s, we were pointing out the clitoridectomies in Egypt and Sudan and whatnot under Islam. They were cutting off the girls' clitori or clitorises, so they don't have sexual pleasure. And it's like, oh my God, how horrible is that? We don't hear anything about that because we've, I think, gone away from any place where we can even say something about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And like my med school training at Einstein, it's now 40 years since 35 years. When I was there, it was 40 or so years from World War II. So it was still fresh in this med school. So there was a lot of emphasis on research, using the Tuskegee example and the Nuremberg example, that conflict of interest and informed consent were these pillar. I mean, they must have said these things a million times about informed consent and conflict of interest, and then to see it all in 2020, suddenly the same people, a lot of them were the same people in position in the institutional review boards. I was applying for research, people who's, how can you think of having people consent to a control group like this? Then suddenly it just was a massive shift. And this is why I blame society itself, not any individuals. And I just published a novel on Amazon Kindle called Crown and Corona. And what to me that is a lot of this big picture stuff. The book flashes around through different periods of history. It's generally autobiographical, but it links, it's called Crown and Corona. It links some of the issues people were dealing with in the American Revolution. It goes to my internship in San Francisco where there was the opioid crisis, and I felt it was insane. Which eventually, 20 years later, they go, how were doctors giving away these meds? But the California legislature, where I did my residency, had, under the Sackler influence, either criminalized or implied criminality to not giving enough opioids. And I'm at San Francisco General Hospital, and superiors are threatening punishment if I don't give all the opioids that they demand, and then admitting it. And now you find out later, it was another industrial complex of recycling these people through the hospital. And that's in the book as well. And it links that stage, the COVID era.
Yeah, I was looking at it. I liked that your guy is Dr. Brush. And as a personal reference, I grew up in Riverdale and in the Bronx. And my pediatrician was Dr. Brush. I mean, I was just kind of noting that. Nobody else is going to care about that, but
no, I like
it. But it's a different day because I've been thinking about Dr. Brush for other reasons lately because I'm trying to reformulate what should be the American vaccine schedule for children. And I remember, Dr. Brush, I probably had a couple, by the time I was an adolescent. I don't know if we had the MMR per se then as a combined thing, but I'm sure we had them. But we had, measles parties. We had German measles parties, and we had chicken pox parties. And that was like the kids get together because they'd rather have that thing young, and they don't want the young girls to get rubella when they're older. So there's kind of like the cusp where we did have some vaccines. I think I had a tetanus shot and stuff like that. But we didn't have, at birth, hepatitis B vaccination and all these other kind of additional ones where, it just kind of keeps getting slathered on. Anyway, so that's Dr. Brush. But I just kind of get back to your addiction point. I've written on the addiction and actually on Purdue more recently for Brownstone. So maybe I'll send that along later. The Sacklers, I think, were scapegoated to a certain extent because, like Willie Sutton said, that's where the money is.
I don't have any particular beef with them. It was really the system that I felt.
Yeah, no, I think I agree that there was a whole pain as a fifth vital sign, but that kind of came independent of the Sacklers, and they went with it, and they actually made an abuse deterrent formulation with OxyContin 1 and more so with OxyContin 2. So they weren't actually being diverted that much, but there was this big push through the academy. But I think the more interesting part is not that they push this or push that, but the fact that they push. And whether, kind of like toothpaste. I mean, my toothpaste really has no choice when I squeeze it what to do. It comes out that one way. And I just don't think doctors should be toothpaste. And I don't think they should be applied in the same way. Even though toothpaste can have a good function and can clean my teeth, it shouldn't be pushed out indiscriminately. And when forget that, but because toothpaste doesn't have thought, but theoretically doctors have more thought than toothpaste, and they should be treated better for having had education. Or why bother? China under Mao had these barefoot doctors, barefoot physicians, and the Soviet had to the same, similar extent. And I went on a kind of post-Soviet when I was the medical director of an outpatient kind of a doc in a box health stop. I had an ex-Soviet physician, a woman, And there were two tiers there. There was kind of the academic tier of physicians, and there was a kind of this barefoot physician. And she was an MD, but she like knew nothing. You know,
Mhm.
she would be happy to have gone along with dictates.
Mhm.
And you know, they were calling me on my off days over and over again, like, what do we do about this sore throat? What do we like? You know, there's kind of like a double aspect of medicine that a lot of people, you know, now we've kind of moved on to nurse practitioners doing a lot of primary care and physicians assistants and whatnot. So we have these kind of second tier physicians, a lot of DO and whatnot. And I think they're happy to kind of rely on accepted wisdom. But then
Mhm.
what is the wisdom part? You know, if we're the kind of the more teaching part and the guys who've studied medicine and so forth, and we're doctors, we're teachers, you know, have we abdicated the role when we just kind of fob it up to the, my new term based on what you said, the medical board, instead of the medical boards, you know, to tell us what to do, and we allow that to happen. And I think so
Mhm.
much of that transpired during COVID. So I threw out a lot there for you. So you can either go down the addiction vein, no pun intended, or kind of like this Borg thinking.
No, the addiction thing to me, having come 20 something years before it and had come in a formula in a formative period for me, internship, when I saw this and I was essentially powerless to fight against it, I thought it was an interesting counterpoint to have watched, specifically like a guy like Gavin Newsom in California, not to pick on him particularly, but they were doing stuff to send they had bills in the California legislature that eventually failed to censor physicians. And I told you it was the same legislative body that I've found the references. They were essentially, it wasn't threatening specific criminal
Mhm.
acts, but there was a open to interpretation for the opioid crisis.
Mhm.
So for me to have lived through that and then seen 20 years later, which is going to happen in 20 years, how are they so stupid to have ruined society for in general, just like then how are people giving opioid addicts more and more? It's so wrong. But it was a small group of people, or I don't know,
Well,
some form of.
there is a medicalization of addiction, and then the medicalization is kind of the point. I have yet another article on the methadone industrial complex. Basically, the actual ignition of the opioid epidemic was a seed in the 1960s.
Mhm,
Rockefeller University, New York City. New York City at the time was beset by crime, and it was
mhm,
coming from um, you know, black African American neighborhoods, Bedford Stuyvesant and Harlem. And in crime, because of narcotics, it was thought, was filtering into the wealthier parts of New York City. And this was a time when there was far less kind of street crime than we have seen in certain other, decades, possibly including currently. Um, and so the reaction to the crime was not to, kind of work on in bettering situations, getting people more jobs, education, whatever, or kind of, annealing the family households and whatnot. So there was less kind of gang, whatever. What they did, basically, they said, oh, these problem people have like the example Keith Abloh gave for me, having read my article, is like they're having an obesity problem, give them donuts.
mhm,
So they don't go out and steal food, and or a hunger problem, however you want to look at it. And so what they came up with this idea of methadone so that narcotic addicts, and again mostly in Harlem and Bedford-Stuy, would not have the need to go out and steal. And so
mhm,
this was before the term harm reduction came into being, but it's a medicalization of a problem that wasn't medical per se,
mhm,
because the previous number of decades there basically were zero narcotic deaths. The 1900s had a lot of opium deaths and morphine deaths, kind of similar to the modern era. Those all disappeared. There was kind of the
mhm,
prohibition phase, and people were kind of like had a better ethos of what it was to be an American. There was better work, all that kind of stuff. And into the 1960s, there was basically zero opioid deaths for probably about 30, 40 years, more than that. And then it all started to change in the 70s when methadone came into being. But my point here is that these things come out of ideas, and the ideas are intellectual, and they wind up having ramifications. You drop pebble in the water and it ripples. Maybe that just dies off. But some things, you have a tripwire and it causes kind of like Rube Goldberg, chain reactions and so forth, and you get something bigger. And these ideas have consequences, and we wound up medicalizing addiction for narcotics, and doctors can write for prescription narcotics, but we didn't medicalize alcohol. For instance, we don't write prescription alcohol. We don't write vodka to replace people's whiskey problem. And alcoholism is a bad thing. It's deadly and all that kind of stuff. We don't see an expansion. We don't see an alcohol epidemic. We don't see epidemic of other addictions that we don't foster. We wound up medicalizing it, and this kind of prevents maturity, and it kind of short circuits people. It's I don't think it's that grossly helpful. And a lot of these things wind up in line with, guess what? Helping doctors grow, and clinics grow, and you wind up with a captured population, but I'm not sure they're better off.
No, I agree. And the problem is the government gets tied up in it, and then they start to mandate or minimize, whatever method it is. They end up playing physician by the state, and then of course it creates an exponential problem rather than let's say you or I as individual physicians had a crazy idea to do like you said, the medicalization of opium on our patients. That's only one small group, and your partner observes it happening and knows it's stupid, so he avoids it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When you have the governor of California saying, this is what we all are going to do, we're all going to do it, anyone who questions it is this, now you have a problem that's unfixable, because there's no control, there's no variation, and you also prevent the guy who might have come up with a good idea of how to manage something on all these issues. And that's where I think the big picture of our society is we have to do something. When I hear the words, we should all, that type of thing, it's almost always a bad or stupid idea, because there's no one solution to everything. Managing dysentery, yes, we should all have clean water. We should all have adequate nutrition, but there's not only one way to do it.
Yeah. And we tend to, because I think humans, we have DNA that runs through our bodies, and, all living things do, I gather, some form of it. But we also, frankly, our emotional DNA is storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people tend to, kind of like moths to a light, they tend to, gravitate, flock to a story. Typhoid Mary was a story. I don't think she was the cause of the entire region's typhoid, but they hunted her down and they made her life miserable. They by force incarcerated her and were medically incarcerated. And then they took out her gallbladder in 1905 or something like that, which I don't know if they used vultures or hyenas or whatever, maybe surgery, but that was going to fix everything. But I think there's this kind of like perverse vilification, and we saw it during COVID, and we still see it now. That there's kind of the good people and the bad people. And when I grew up, people with masks were the bad people. Those are your bank robbers and burglars,
bandits,
and bandits, so forth. And now they're running around that they have the goodness, and frankly, kind of this normalization of masks has made crime increase. One of the secondary, again, kind of the road to hell is paved with good intention. I'm not even sure that's a good intention, but it was an intention. But I was looking at some videos of the January 6th bomb, whoever left the bomb in front of the DNC headquarters, or whatever, is wearing a mask while walking through from Washington, and nobody pays any attention because it's 2020 and everyone was supposed to be wearing masks.
The exact opposite of the post-September 11th movement about,
I apologize, it was 2021. I would not have made sense. It was January 6th, 2021.
If I said 2011, I meant 2001. Post-September 11th, you were supposed to reopen, show that you're open and you're not like a bandit walking around on the street with a bomb.
Yeah. That person would have been noticed and so forth, but we've kind of normalized this. So everyone you don't know who that person is. And it's kind of taken away some of the, say social trust. So how we've spent a half hour or so talking about problems and so forth. So let's see if we can think about solutions.
Mm-hmm.
What are the fixes?
That's a very good question. And if you notice, the themes that I keep coming back to are individual choice. And it's not so much that we can all like, oh, I want to, you know, I have dysentery and I want to poop in the water supply here so I can do it. I mean it with, instead of having too many state pronouncements, there's probably ways where, and I don't love the whole influencer, and because it tends to create um, exponential movements, and we should, it goes both ways. The we should ban vaccines, we should
Right.
force vaccine. You don't have, it doesn't have to be so stark and order based. That, to me, I prefer a world where most things are minding your own business. Everything is essentially smaller. We lead by, physicians are more lead by example as coach. The problem is it's a smaller money model, which Americans won't like, where we have a world where physicians are encouraging a healthy lifestyle and talking about sun and food and things like that. The problem of this view is it's not a it's not for capital. You can't start a corporation based on it. You're not going to make billions the way you did. So how do you modify it? And that's why I think it's at a societal level. Um, I've read a translation of this book, the Tao Te Ching. Have you heard of this or read this book? It's basically, it was the answer to Confucianism in China thousands of years ago, Lao Tzu, and it's essentially about just following nature, following your own, being your own master, essentially. And I think a physician, almost a community physician, rather than like me, a specialist, always everything is this high tech stuff. We're always leading towards this road. Empower the individual to know that most of their health is in their own hands.
Mm-hmm.
And medicine should be small and rare. But the problem is, to implement this, what is it going to take? The only way to implement it is through grassroots, meaning to write books and teach patients and say, you don't need to go in there and ask for Skyrizi and what you saw on TV. Stay home. If you need to go once a year, that's fine. I don't know that this is the right answer. And obviously there's going to be medical conditions, but my view would be to model it more on a where we shrink instead of grow, which is again the antithesis of capitalism, but it's also not. I would prefer a free market.
It is aligned with free market principles. I think there are systemic issues. They're big picture issues. They have to do with kind of what I call the paternal model of medicine. And I talked earlier about the military. So the military, you don't really have choice. I mean, you make your bed a certain way, you cut your hair a certain way, you wear the same clothes, or you wear whatever clothes they tell you, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not, I imagine you get to pick out what you want for lunch to a certain extent, but other than that, you're going to bed here, whatever. You have Liberty Days, yes. But the problem, I think, is the way we buy stuff. So we look at, the free market model. Do we have a free market in medicine? And it's a captured market. So there are some free aspects to it. Then there's some that are not. They're siloed. So you have to kind of open this up, and it may not be. It's a little bit like the colleges. The colleges, I think, have a very similar system. Your kid's going to go to college. You're going to get Pell Grants, or you're going to get this. There's financial aid. There's a whole kind of quasi-governmental apparatus that basically ensures, kind of like health insurance. Certain parts of health insurance are governmental, as Medicare and state welfare programs and whatnot, and it wind up kind of raising the prices and compartmentalizing and putting a moat around that industry, protecting it. So universities have this, and you have this credential. When you come out of college, you have that bachelor's degree, master's, whatever it is. And if you got just as smart, doing the Peter Thiel method, or Zuckerberg or Gates, whatever, having 1 year of college and then running out and doing your own stuff, or 0 years of college like Thomas Edison and whatnot, then you are, good luck to you. But you could probably get ahead faster. And, a lot of times plumbers and HVAC guys make more than the, person with 5 master's degree who has, sideline and teaching and driving an Uber. But, the problem has to do with 2 aspects. From the bottom up, the insurance aspect, where, Ann Coulter wrote on this, is like, we don't have a car insurance crisis. We don't have a property insurance crisis. We have a health insurance crisis, because it's not really insurance anymore. It winds up being a kind of cooperative thing, which bends over whenever people have a pre-existing problem. Now, if you have a pre-existing car issue, that's your problem. The guy looks at it, says, okay, you already have a dent. I rent a car. It's like we check the dents before and after, and that kind of stuff. So that's a genuine insurance system, but we don't have medical insurance because it's not insurance. And so on the one hand, so we have this flawed thing. We're in a system. We're all together. It's quasi-military, quasi-college, and so forth. And then we get our choices top down, and we don't necessarily get to do a free market thing. So, genuine free market, like you and I are wearing different shirts. We're both wearing shirts. We might, societally see the need to have a shirt, and we're both wearing collared shirts. And so we both wanted that thing. Okay. But yours is different. Yours is, I don't know where you got yours, and you're, we're both in a room someplace. Your paint is different. We both chose those things on some level. Maybe our spouses did, who knows? But we didn't, we weren't ordered. We weren't told, like when we're 8 years old, we're told, and so medicine has an aspect of that paternal model where you're a 9-year-old. And so you say, I want X, I want this. Well, the doctor says, that's not for you. And it's very hard and difficult to get that second or third opinion, or to go outside the system. So insofar as we can kind of recreate a shopping model, and then have different silos, I think that is a very feasible model. We see it in almost everything we do conceptually, and shopping. We have many, many different places, but we all wind up with shoes. So I'm not telling people not to have shoes. I'm not telling people not to have shirts, but they can easily figure that stuff out. People buy cars and homes, which are huge life-altering propositions, a home in particular, or not having one, or whatever. And we can do that with most of our safety issues. And I don't see why we can't, at some level, figure that out with health. Now, grooming a population that's ready to do that is more of a difficult undertaking. And I think we've moved away from that model by having families dissolve.
I agree with you. And like you said about insurance, like obesity, we destigmatized it as a field. So instead of this is what I was saying about subjectivity. We're not allowed. You're almost not supposed to mention that. Obviously you can, and I try to work around that to have the discussion, because it's an important discussion. But by destigmatizing the one big thing, or this is an example of one thing, we're actually encouraging more of it by not telling, no, it's just the itchiness. That's not anything related to your health. Let me give you a cream for that. It's essentially a form of negligence, but seeming kind. So it's this, like this empathy it's actually not empathy that we use. And it's like, I could say something was, no, it's perfectly healthy. No, you keep doing it. You take opioids, be obese, drive poorly. They're just diseases. You can't control them. You were born with those genes.
Yeah.
You are going to have to suffer, but do all those things you enjoy. And then, we can't figure out why premiums are skyrocketing, all the things we're saying, but we're actually not even fixing the problem. We're literally almost, you're healthy. You got the COVID. Okay, good. Then you're healthy, but no, keep doing all those other poor habits, because that's just a disease.
I'm probably going to go to health for this, but I think it's a male-female dialectic, to use a Marxian term. I think we have feminized a lot of our societal apparati, and medicine included. I think the best internet video ever made was, I don't know if you've seen it, the girl with the nail in her head. Ever seen that one?
I don't know this one.
Oh, so it's awesome. I mean, describing it's not going to do it justice, but it's a pretty young girl and a couple. They're about 30, whatever, and she's got this huge nail in her head. You don't see it at first. She's off, kind of turned her head. It's like, I have this incredible pain in my head, and I don't know what to do. It's been going on, and the guy keeps trying to interrupt. Honey, do you think it's and would you stop with that? It's like, and she turns around. She's got this huge nail in her head. But I can't stop it. The guy's like, you have a nail in your head, which it's just, I don't want to hear about it. Anyway, so can you just listen? Why can't you just listen? So he shuts up. He's listening. And she goes on. It's like, I had it every day when I turn over my sleep. Anyway, going on and on. And he's like, well, honey, I bet that's really hard for you. And I completely understand how your days are filled with pain. She's like, oh, you're so wonderful. And she turns to hug him and it bangs the nail into her head.
Yeah.
And anyway, it's just kind of like a metaphor for so much. I mean, just, all these things are a nail in your head. You're overweight and you're Lizzo and you want to be celebrated for it. It's like, well, okay, fine. I don't have to love the nail in your head. You're welcome to be with it. I know how to get the nail out and you would do better with it out. But you want to go around with it. I don't care. Don't trip me up and so forth. But a lot of this has turned into this kind of we have to deal with your feelings over things, and we have to keep you from doing stuff. So I run this political group called A Family, and my men are no longer kids, but at a certain point, even it kind of resonates now. We kind of repeat our patterns because we don't change. For my sons, I'll be like, no, you want this? No, I can't do that. Go figure it out. And my wife is, she'll try to like ameliorate things and make things better and kind of soften things, which is fine. I mean, I think that, it's the yin yang. I think she's the yin. I don't know, maybe I'm the yang. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's like one of those things. It's like you need the both. You can't do just one or the other. And we've turned to yin and we don't have enough yang, if that's correct. I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know which one's which, but I totally agree with. I mean, just to bring up the same thing, like you said, Lizzo comes into your office. This is a common thing in the clinic that I work in, where the level of obesity, you have sleep apnea, and you get a itchy, dry throat, and you're prone to getting throat infections or whatever someone calls throat infections. So you have someone with a BMI of 40 and you explain, oh, you have sleep apnea and it's breathing issues. And they say, well, I just want you to take my tonsils out. I'm not interested in what you're telling me. So you kind of have to say, well, I'm not going to, and the surgery then becomes high risk. So they're literally creating a surgical problem from they know what words to use, and their primary doctor may or may not have agreed, depends on the person, may or may not have agreed with their framework of how it is, and their solution is they want someone else to essentially fix their problem, but of course it's not fixable. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, well, in this case, there's kind of this dual parental thing where you have your right to be a parent and say, I work with a guy who's strict Catholic, and when he was in residency at Brown, which is a very liberal place, Providence, he was doing family medicine, and he had to deliver babies and so forth, and do counseling for young women and whatnot. And there was a lot of call to do, to get into the abortion field, and he did not, and he would not advise abortion, and so they made him a speed bump, for people to either go over or not, and so they people who wanted that diverted away. So he had his right to, in my view, to practice medicine he saw fit, and people had a right to go to him or not go to him. So I think that's the way it would interdigitate. It'd be kind of like a multi-gear. But what we have oftentimes instead is kind of instrumentalism, a kind of a downward push from above about what should be happening. Again, this kind of military concept, and using the Eisenhowerian, military, medical, industrial complex. So we're kind of rounding out the hour a little bit, and I talked over most of your time, and I apologize.
No, no, you did great.
But you know, we didn't come up with a solution per se. But I'm curious, in the aftermath of COVID, and in the math, the during math of COVID, how was that practicing? And what are the lessons learned or not? And how much kind of like push and pull did you receive in your own practice during that episode? And what were your kind of major challenges or struggles therein?
That's a great question. And then I unfortunately have to run in like 2 minutes.
Yep.
I, in a lot of ways, I know this. In some ways, it was a good period because I think in some ways it pulled back the curtain, like in The Wizard
Mhm.
of Oz, on what was really going on. I think I've been frustrated for years, essentially, with this top-down management
Mhm.
system of here's how it works and insurance covers this. But I never really had a voice or a way to say it or a way to rationalize it. So I think it almost needed to get terrible before I could start speaking about it or feel like I had nothing to lose to start to communicate about it. Um, so for me, it was a transformational period, and that's why that novel I wrote was a 3 act, a classic to me, like a hero story where uh, part one of the act one was is called disease as statecraft, and it's about putting it's basically how the governments were using um, have a history of how governments have used illness to make political change. It's a political tool.
Mhm.
Step part two or act two, because I like that 3 act model, was is called truth over loyalty. And truth over loyalty is because I mean I'm sure you have the same thing. Maybe you weren't as indoctrinated as I was, but I was indoctrinated in the system to be loyal and to follow the standard of care and laugh at people who don't follow the standard of care. And, if the governor says there's a health crisis, I ought to be the first one to, do it. So for me, truth over loyalty was that turning point. Is it better to stay the truth and harm your practice, risk getting fired? And I worked at Jacoby Medical Center, which is an epicenter place and still is with the mass and this, it's
Mhm.
like an army of people who still 100% are bought in. The vast majority of almost everyone. I'm like an outcast because I'm
Mm.
one of the few people who doesn't buy into any of it. And I see the government and this part of it as a major obtrusion. And the fact that they think I'm not allowed to have a voice, even though I'm an ENT and do respiratory stuff all the time in an urban setting, how could you censor me? It's insane. So for me, truth over loyalty was the turning point for the character in the book. There's a revolutionary path, and in this, where the characters were essentially trying to decide: do you stay loyal to the crown, or is individual freedom important? Did Britain provide individual freedom? If you look, there was a complex period. Were they doing the right thing? Are the Corona people doing the right thing? It's not as clear cut as Star Wars, where
Yeah.
Darth Vader is wearing a helmet. It's more, no, these are doctors, other doctors, public health people. Maybe they do know more than me. Maybe I should keep my mouth shut. So it's a wrestling with truth. And then part three is called yielding with strength. Look, there isn't going to be a Death Star blow up moment for me with this. Like I said about the Star Wars as the hero's journey, I'm not trying to say I'm a hero. It's a way of wrestling with an individual national thing. So there's not going to be a blow up the Death Star or use your Spitfire to, win the
Right.
battle of Britain. So yielding with strength is where the main character learns how to deal with this crazy world by continuing to pursue truth in his own way without essentially causing themselves to end their career or things like that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Howard. I want to tell people if they want to help support my video cast, they can buy my book. It's Overturning Zika.
I'd like
Um,
to do that.
yeah, I got to say, it's a great thing. It's something I didn't plan on writing. I'm not an ID guy, nor tropical specialist. I'd never seen Zika, but I was kind of
I
intrigued by.
remember the hype from that time too, and questioning it, but I never really looked into it. So I'm looking
Yeah, it's
forward
an
to.
amazing episode. There was not that much. Short answer is there was not. Zika's real, microcephaly is real, but there's no real connection between them, and it was overblown. It became a panic. It's kind of tulip mania of Brazil. So I want to thank you very much for being on, and hope to talk with you soon.